The morning Grace Ralston understood that everything she had ever built could vanish in a single night came to her not as a revelation, but as a wall of heat against her face, a roar of orange light consuming the only home she had ever truly owned, and the terrible silence of a man who would never answer her cries again. She had been 26 years old when she married Thomas Ralston. He was a good man, steady and quiet, the kind of man who rose before sunrise and went to bed with calloused hands and a clear conscience. They had come west together in the spring of 1878, following the promise that Kansas held for people willing to work the earth with everything they had. The homestead they built outside of Dodge City, 12 miles south of town on a wide stretch of flat, wind-combed prairie, was not much to look at in the beginning. A single-room soddy with a timber frame, a well they dug together with borrowed shovels, a chicken coop Thomas nailed together from scrap lumber he hauled back from the lumber yard on the wagon. But over 5 years they had grown it into something real, a proper timber house with 2 rooms and a sleeping loft. A barn that could shelter 4 horses and a milk cow. A garden that Grace tended with a ferocity that surprised even her, coaxing tomatoes and beans and squash from the hard Kansas soil with her bare hands. Then the drought came in the summer of 1883, and after the drought came the land dispute. Harlan Voss was a cattle baron who had been slowly absorbing homesteads along the southern stretch of Dodge City's surrounding farmland for 3 years. He operated with a smile and a handshake whenever he could, and with other methods when he could not. He had his eye on the Ralston land because it sat between 2 parcels he already owned, and because the well Thomas had dug hit a deep vein of clean water that did not dry up even in the worst heat. Thomas had refused to sell, had refused twice with polite firmness and once with a rifle resting across his forearm, making the words very clear. Harlan Voss did not take refusal well. Thomas Ralston died in November of 1883. The official account, written up by a sheriff who rode for Dodge City and owed more than a few favors to powerful men, declared it an accident. A horse had spooked. Thomas had been thrown. Grace had knelt beside her husband's body in the cold mud of their yard, and had known with every instinct she possessed that the story was a lie. But she had no proof and no allies and nothing but grief in her chest like a stone that would not dissolve. She buried Thomas herself. 2 neighbors came, the Hendersons from 4 miles east, and they stood with her in the frozen ground while a traveling preacher said what words he knew. Then they went home, because that was the way of things on the frontier, where survival demanded that a person not linger too long in sorrow. Grace lingered anyway. She spent the winter alone, feeding the animals, keeping the fire going, writing letters to her sister in Missouri that she never sent because she did not want anyone to see how close to breaking she was. She had no children. She and Thomas had wanted them badly, but the years had not given them any, and now that absence felt like a particular cruelty, because there was no one to hold, no one who needed her in the raw animal way that a child needed its mother, nothing to force her to keep moving except her own stubborn will. By the time April came, she had made a decision. She would not sell to Harlan Voss. She would not sell to anyone. She would work the land through spring and summer, and she would find a way to survive, because Thomas had believed in this place, and she owed it to him not to let it be taken. She had not counted on fire. She did not know with certainty who set it. The night of May the 4th, 1884, she woke to the smell of smoke and came downstairs to find the barn already burning, the flames leaping high enough to light the whole yard orange. And by the time she had dragged herself out of the house, the fire had caught the corner of the timber frame of the house itself, because the spring wind was blowing hard from the south, and it carried embers like burning seeds. She got the milk cow out of the barn, half blind and screaming, and she got the 2 horses out, and then she stood in the yard and watched everything else go. The house burned through to its skeleton. The barn was ash before dawn. The chicken coop went without her even noticing when it happened. By the time the sun came up, Grace Ralston was standing at the edge of what had been her home with nothing in her hands and nothing in her pockets and the clothes on her back smelling of smoke, staring at the ruins with eyes that were dry only because she had run out of tears somewhere around midnight. She did not know what to do next. For the first time in her adult life, she genuinely did not know what to do. She thought about the Hendersons and knew they had their own troubles. She thought about town and knew that a widow with no money and no proof of anything was a very small voice against Harlan Voss's money and his friends in the sheriff's office. She stood there with her hands open at her sides, empty and still, and the morning wind moved through the burned beams above her and made a sound like a sigh. That was when she heard hoofbeats. The rider came from the north, following the wagon road that cut across the prairie. He was on a dark bay horse, a good animal, moving at a steady lope, and he slowed as he came close enough to see what was in front of him. Grace did not turn around at first. She heard the horse slow to a walk and then stop, heard the leather creak of a saddle, heard boots hit the ground. She turned. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dusty canvas coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather. He had dark hair and a jaw that needed a shave and eyes that were brown and direct, and she noticed immediately, not calculating. There was no flicker of opportunity in his face, no quick assessment of what advantage her situation might offer him. He looked at the burned homestead. He looked at her standing in front of it with her empty hands. He took his hat off. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried. "My name is Wesley Talbot. I was riding for Dodge City and I came off the main road about a mile back because I could see the smoke from yesterday evening." He paused. He looked at the ruins again. "Where do we begin?" 3 words. Not "I'm sorry," not "what a terrible thing," not the clucking sympathy that she had received from a dozen strangers since Thomas died. Just that. A practical question that assumed, without any ceremony or discussion, that he was going to help and that the only thing to decide was the order of tasks. Grace stared at him for a moment. Her throat was tight. She said, "The well is still good, I think." "That's the first good thing," he said. He walked to his horse and looped the reins over what remained of a fence post, then turned and looked at her with full, serious attention. "Are you hurt? Any burns, anything like that?" "No," she said. "When did you last eat or drink anything?" She had to think about it. "Yesterday at supper." He went to his saddlebag and came back with a canteen and a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to be 2 hardtack biscuits and a strip of dried beef. He held them out to her without making it a gesture of charity, just as a man hands a tool to another person who needs it. "Eat that," he said. "Then tell me what happened." She ate. It was remarkable how much easier it was to think with something in her stomach. She told him about the fire, told him she believed it had been set deliberately, told him about Harlan Voss and the land dispute and her dead husband and the useless sheriff in Dodge City. She was not emotional about it. She stated facts. Wesley Talbot listened without interrupting, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment, looking at the ruins. "You own this land outright?" he asked. "Thomas filed the claim under the Homestead Act in 1878. I have the papers." "Had the papers." She stopped. "They were in the house." "The land office in Dodge City will have records," he said. "That's where we start. We go to town, we verify your claim on record, and we establish that you have legal right to this property before Voss or anyone else can move on it." She looked at him. He was a stranger. He had ridden in off a wagon road and she had no idea who he was or where he was from or what his intentions were. And yet something in the way he spoke made her trust what he was saying, not because it was reassuring but because it was sensible. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Help a stranger." He looked at her directly and without deflection. "My mother was a widow," he said. "She had land in Texas. Men like your Harlan Voss took it from her when I was 12 years old and there was nobody around to do a damn thing about it. I've been carrying that for 20 years. He put his hat back on. "So when I see a woman standing at the edge of a burned homestead, I stop." He was 32 years old. She would learn that later. He had worked cattle drives out of Texas and New Mexico, had spent 2 years as a deputy marshal in Abilene before the law there became more politics than justice, and had been riding north toward Dodge City to take a job managing a ranch for a man named Caleb Pruitt, who he had known for a decade. He was nobody's hero. He was a working man who had seen the wrong end of injustice enough times to recognize it on sight. Grace Ralston looked at Wesley Talbot in the clear morning light of a Kansas May and said, "All right, let's go to town." She rode behind him on the bay horse, because her own horses had run in the night and she had no saddle anyway. She sat straight and did not hold on to him, keeping her balance with her knees the way a person does when they are determined not to lean on anyone. It was 6 miles to Dodge City on the wagon road, and they made it in just over an hour. Dodge City in 1884 was still a cattle town, though the great drives up the Kishom Trail were already beginning to wind down as the railroad spread, and the ranges moved further west. It was loud and dirty and full of energy, a place where fortunes were made and lost inside the same week, where the saloons along Front Street ran day and night, and the smell of livestock and dust and wood smoke hung over everything like a second sky. Grace had been coming to town regularly for 5 years, and she knew its rhythms. She also knew which men in it could be trusted and which could not. The land office was run by a man named Gordon Fleece, a meticulous and conscientious bureaucrat in his mid-40s who took his records very seriously and was, as far as Grace knew, not in Harlan Voss's pocket. He confirmed Thomas Ralston's homestead claim within 20 minutes of their arrival, produced the filed documents from his cabinet with the calm efficiency of a man who kept every paper in its place, and noted for the record that Grace Ralston, as surviving spouse, was the legal holder of the claim. "You'll want to have that confirmed by a probate judge," Fleece told them. "Shouldn't be difficult. Judge Harrison is in Dodge through the end of the month." Wesley had been standing to one side during all of this, hat in hand, letting Grace conduct the business herself. She noticed that. He had not tried to speak for her or over her. When Fleece finished, Wesley said, "What would it take for someone to contest that claim?" Fleece looked at him. "You'd need either proof the original claim was fraudulent, which it isn't, or you'd need the claim holder to have abandoned the property, which requires the holder to have been absent for a specified period." "So as long as she stays on the land," Wesley said, "it can't be claimed by anyone else." "That's correct," Fleece said. They looked at each other, Grace and Wesley, across the small office with its smell of paper and ink. She understood what he was thinking and the problem it presented. She had no shelter. She had nothing to go back to. But if she left the land, even briefly, it opened a door that Harlan Voss would certainly walk through. "I have to go back," she said. "Yes," he said. "You do." They left the land office and stood on the plank sidewalk along Front Street in the spring morning. Grace was still wearing the smoke-stained dress she had slept in and woken to a fire in, and she was very tired, and her hands were still empty, and the immensity of everything she needed to do was beginning to settle on her with its full weight. "I need supplies," she said, thinking aloud. "Timber for a shelter of some kind. Tools because all mine burned. Seeds because I need to put in a garden before the season passes. A new rifle because I have a feeling I'm going to need one. I have $32 in a savings account at the bank because Thomas always said not to keep all your money in the house, and I never understood why until now." She paused. $32 is not going to cover any of this." "No," Wesley agreed. "It isn't." He looked up the street and then back at her. "Can you give me 1 hour?" She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to see Caleb Pruitt," he said. "The man I came to Dodge City to work for. He's a fair man and he owes me a favor from about 7 years back when I pulled him out of a very bad situation outside of Amarillo. I'm going to ask him to advance me a month's wages." Grace shook her head. "I'm not taking your wages." "You're not taking anything," he said, with a patience that was not condescending but simply steady. "We're going to figure out a way to rebuild your homestead. I will provide the labor and some of the supplies. You will pay me back when you have a crop and can afford to, or you won't, and I won't hold it against you either way. But right now we don't have time to argue about pride, Because every day you spend in town is a day Voss has to make his move." She stared at him. Nobody had spoken to her with that kind of directness since Thomas. Even Thomas had sometimes gone around things carefully, not wanting to upset her. Wesley Talbot looked at her like he trusted her to handle the truth without flinching. "1 hour," she said. He was back in 45 minutes with $40 in paper money and a receipt from the mercantile saying he had put in an order for a load of timber to be delivered to the Ralston homestead the following morning. He also had a new rifle wrapped in brown paper, a Remington rolling block in .30 caliber, and a box of cartridges. "Prout said he was sorry about your husband," Wesley told her. "He said Thomas Ralston bought cattle off him twice and always paid square." Something cracked very slightly inside Grace's chest at hearing Thomas described in the present tense of a practical transaction, his honesty surviving him in the ledgers of men who had done business with him. She pressed her lips together and nodded. "We need to stop at the general store," she said. "I have a list." They spent 2 hours in Dodge City purchasing what she needed. Wesley carried things and offered opinions when she asked for them and did not offer them when she did not. He found a second-hand tent at the hardware store, a good canvas tent that drovers sometimes used on the trail, and he bought that as well. When she protested the cost, he simply folded it under his arm and walked toward the counter, and she decided she had larger battles to fight. On the way out of town, they stopped at the sheriff's office, because Wesley said they should file a report about the fire regardless of how little good it might do. Sheriff Dawes was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache who listened to Grace's account with the expression of a man who had already decided what he thought before she opened her mouth. He said he would look into it. Wesley gave him a look that communicated without any particular hostility that he was being noted and that his conduct in this matter would have consequences if it was found wanting. Dawes did not like it, but he wrote the report. "He's Voss's man," Grace said quietly as they left. "Yes," Wesley said. "So we're going to have to handle this a different way." The ride back to the homestead was longer because the bay horse was now carrying 2 people plus a considerable amount of supplies in the saddlebags and a bedroll tied behind. They took it slow. The sun was high and warm, and the Kansas prairie spread around them in every direction, flat and golden and enormous, and for the first time since the fire Grace found herself able to look at the landscape without the burned image of her homestead superimposed over it. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Bastrop County, Texas," he said. "East Texas, near the Colorado River. My father was a rancher before the war. We lost most of what we had during Reconstruction, and then my mother lost what was left to men who knew how to use legal mechanisms to take what they wanted." "Is that why you became a deputy?" "Partly," he said, "and partly because I was good with a gun and I needed to eat, and the law seemed like a better use of those skills than the alternative." She found herself curious about him in a way she had not been curious about a man since the early days of her courtship with Thomas. It was not romantic exactly, not yet. It was more like recognizing something familiar in a stranger, the way you sometimes look at a person across a room and understand instinctively that they have known the same kind of weather you have. "Did you have a family?" she asked. "Wife, children?" "No," he said, without particular sadness. "I came close once. A woman in Abilene named Martha, but she wanted a man who came home at the same time every day and slept in the same bed every night, and I wasn't able to give her that. She married a banker." He paused. "I hope she's happy. Are you sorry about it?" "Some days," he said, "less than I used to be." They arrived back at the homestead in the early afternoon. The ruins looked worse in the full daylight than they had in the gray of morning, the charred timbers stark against the pale Kansas sky, the smell of burned wood still heavy in the air. Grace stood looking at it for a moment, and then she straightened her back and looked away from it. "Where will you sleep tonight?" she asked. "I'll put the tent up near the well," he said. "I've slept in worse situations." "I'll sleep in the tent," she said. "You can have the barn." She paused. "There is no barn." "I'll make do," he said. They worked through the afternoon. Wesley clearing burned debris while Grace sorted through the ruins for anything salvageable. She found her iron skillet, warped but usable. She found a tin box that had protected a few papers and some buttons, and a tintype of Thomas and her on their wedding day, the paper brown around the edges but the image intact. She held it for a moment, this small square of their life together, and then she put it carefully in her pocket and kept working. She found Thomas's watch under a fallen beam, the glass cracked but the mechanism still ticking. She wound it and listened to it tick, and was obscurely comforted by its small, faithful sound. Wesley put the tent up near the well, as he had said he would. He offered it to her with a matter-of-fact courtesy that she accepted with equal matter-of-factness, and she spread her blanket inside it and made it as tidy as she could while he cleared a space in what had been the barn's corner, where 2 stone foundation walls still stood, and laid his own bedroll there. It was not comfortable. It was shelter, and shelter was everything. They ate supper together over a small fire he built from wood they had scavenged, bacon and beans from the supplies they had bought in town, and the conversation came more easily in the firelight than it had on the road. "Tell me about Thomas," Wesley said. He said it simply, not with the performative sensitivity of someone who has decided to ask because they think they should, but genuinely, as if he actually wanted to know. She told him. She talked about the way Thomas hummed to himself while he worked, always slightly off-key, always cheerful. She talked about the spring they had run out of money entirely and had lived on cornmeal and wild rabbit for 6 weeks until the wheat came in. She talked about the evening they had sat on the porch of the half-finished house and watched a sunset so extravagant it had seemed almost embarrassing, all pink and gold and purple spread across the enormous Kansas sky, and Thomas had said, "I think God was showing off for us personally," and she had laughed until she cried. "He sounds like a good man," Wesley said. "He was the best man I knew," she said, and the words were simple and true and did not require her to apologize for them. "Then this place deserves to be rebuilt," Wesley said, "for him as much as for you." She looked at him across the fire. He was watching the flames with a quiet expression, and she thought that he was the kind of man who could be still without being absent, who carried his thoughts close and did not scatter them carelessly. "Why did you really stop?" she asked. He looked up. "I told you, my mother, I know what you told me," she said. "I believe it, but there's something else, I can see it." He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped and settled. A coyote called somewhere out on the dark prairie, a long wavering sound that faded into the wind. "I've been moving for 20 years, he said at last. "Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas. One place and then the next, and every time I leave a place I leave it clean, nothing behind me, nothing tying me. I told myself it was freedom." He looked at the burned homestead and then back at her. "When I saw you standing there this morning, I thought about all the places I'd ridden past and all the things I'd decided weren't my concern. I don't know. I just didn't want to ride past this one." The fire burned down to coals. They said good night and went to their separate shelters, and Grace lay in the tent with Thomas's watch ticking in her pocket and looked at the canvas above her and thought about a man who had ridden 20 years without stopping and had stopped this morning here. The timber arrived the next day as promised, a full wagon load from the lumber yard in Dodge City, driven by a taciturn man named Hector who helped them unload it, and then drove away without a word. Wesley Talbot could build, it turned out. He had learned it watching his father and had done enough of it over the years to be skilled if not polished, and he approached the task with the same steady competence he seemed to bring to everything. Grace worked alongside him. She was not a woman who watched while others worked. She had built alongside Thomas, and she knew how to hold a beam in place while a man nailed it, knew how to read a level, knew how to cut a joint that would hold. Wesley noticed this without comment the first day, and by the second day they had settled into a working rhythm that felt almost practiced, the kind of wordless coordination that usually takes much longer to develop between people. Caleb Prout came out on the third day to check on things and to meet Grace. He was a broad, sunburned man in his 50s with a reputation for being fair that had apparently survived contact with reality, and he shook Grace's hand with the gravity of a man who takes women seriously. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said, "and I'm sorry about your house. This is not the way things should go for people who work their land honest." He looked at Wesley. "You doing all right for materials? We could use another man for 2 or 3 days," Wesley said. "Raising the frame walls goes faster with 3. "I'll send you my man Lewis," Prout said. "He's good, and I'll send another timber load, whatever you need beyond what's here. You can settle with me later, Mrs. Ralston, or you can call it a debt I owed Wesley and not worry about it." Grace said, "I'll settle with you later. I don't carry debts I can't account for." Prout smiled. "You're right to say so." He nodded at Wesley. "I can see why you stopped." Lewis arrived the following morning, a wiry and precise man from Sonora, Mexico, who had been working for Caleb Prout for 6 years, and who built things with an attention to detail that Grace found immediately admirable. He spoke English carefully and formally, and he treated Grace with a courteous directness that she appreciated. The 4 days that followed were the hardest work Grace had done since the year they built the original house, but they were also strangely, almost guiltily alive. There was something clarifying about physical labor, about the specific problem of a beam that needed to be here and a nail that needed to go there, about the measurable progress of a wall going up where yesterday there had been nothing. She fell into bed each evening exhausted in a way that was clean and productive rather than hollow, and she slept without dreaming. She was aware of Wesley Talbot in the way you are aware of weather. He moved through the days efficiently, making decisions when decisions were needed, and leaving her to make them when they were hers to make. He was funny, she discovered, in a dry and unexpected way, the kind of humor that surfaces in the middle of difficult work and makes the difficulty easier without trivializing it. He told a story one afternoon about a cattle drive he had been on in New Mexico, where every single member of the crew had, through a complicated chain of miscommunications, ended up convinced that a different member of the crew was secretly a wanted man, and the resulting 3 days of everyone watching everyone else with enormous suspicion, while actually driving cattle, had nearly ended in disaster. He told it with such understated precision that Grace laughed harder than she had laughed in months, and the laughing felt like something breaking loose that had been stuck. After that, the atmosphere between them changed slightly. Not dramatically, nothing that would have been visible to Lewis or even to Prout if he had been there. But something in the way they spoke to each other became less careful, less measured, more natural. She started telling him things she had not planned to tell him. He started telling her things he mentioned in the manner of a man who is surprised to find himself saying them. She told him about the letters to her sister she had never sent. He told her about a winter in Colorado where he had been snowed in for 3 weeks in a one-room cabin with nothing to read but a Bible and a surveying manual, and how he had ended up reading both of them so thoroughly that he could still quote from both. "Which do you prefer?" she asked. "Depends on the terrain," he said, and she laughed again. One evening, 10 days after he had ridden in, they were sitting on the framing of what was becoming the new house's porch, looking at the sunset. Lewis had gone back to Prout's ranch 2 days ago, and the work that remained was slower and more detailed, the kind of work that 2 people could do without hurrying. The walls were up. The roof was half done. It was beginning to look like something. The sunset was extraordinary, one of those Kansas evenings where the sky turns colors that don't have names, deep and violent and gorgeous. Thomas would have said God was showing off again, Grace said, without really meaning to say it out loud. Wesley was quiet for a moment. He would have been right, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the sky, and his profile in the last light was clear and still. And she thought about how strange it was that she had stood in ashes 10 days ago, and here was this man beside her who had ridden in from nowhere and was helping her build something back. She thought about what it meant that she found herself watching his hands when he worked, noticing the way he explained things to her like she was an intelligent person rather than a problem to be managed, noticing that when he laughed there was something in his face that was almost surprised, as if he had not expected to find laughter here any more than she had. "What happens," she said carefully, "when the house is finished?" He looked at her then. "What do you mean?" "I mean you came to Dodge City to manage Caleb Pruitt's ranch," she said. "That's your work. I can't keep you here indefinitely." He was quiet for a long moment. A nighthawk cut across the sky above them, its wings a brief shadow against the diminishing light. "Pruitt's ranch is a day's ride," he said. "It's not the other side of the world." "No," she said, "it isn't." They looked at each other in the fading light, and the thing that had been building between them for 10 days was there in the space between them, visible and unnamed. "I'm not ready," she said very honestly. "I don't know if I'll be ready for a long time." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just want you to know that Pruitt's ranch is a day's ride and not the other side of the world." She nodded. He nodded. They sat in the last light watching the colors leave the sky, and it was enough for now. The matter of Harlan Voss could not be ignored indefinitely, and Wesley knew it even if he did not push Grace on the subject while the building was underway. But on the morning of the 14th day, they had a visitor that made the subject impossible to defer. A man rode in just after breakfast, a broad man on a gray horse, wearing a black coat and carrying the easy authority of someone who is accustomed to having his presence be significant. He was perhaps 60, with a heavy white mustache and eyes the color of river water in winter. He dismounted in the yard and looked at the half-finished house and then at Wesley and then at Grace. "Mrs. Ralston," he said, "I'm Harlan Voss." Grace stood very still. Her hands were at her sides. She was wearing a worn work dress and her hair was pinned back and there was sawdust on her sleeves, and she looked at Harlan Voss with a clarity that she was privately proud of. "I know who you are," she said. "I've come to make you a fair offer," he said. $200 for the land and whatever improvements are currently on it. He looked at the framing behind her. "Which I see are being rebuilt, which I think is admirable. But a woman alone out here on this particular stretch of land has a difficult road ahead." $200, Grace said, "when the land is worth 10 times that with the water rights." Voss smiled. It was a practiced smile, smooth as river stone. "The water rights are speculative." "The water rights are why your man set fire to my home," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. He did not look at Wesley, which was interesting, though Wesley was standing 10 feet away with his arms folded, and the particular stillness of a man who is paying very close attention to every word. "That's a serious accusation," Voss said. "It's a serious matter," Grace said. "And I've filed a report with the sheriff, and I've confirmed my ownership with the land office, and I've spoken to Judge Harrison, who has confirmed probate of my husband's estate in my name." All of this was true. She and Wesley had visited Judge Harrison 3 days ago specifically so that all these things would be true. "So I want you to understand, Mr. Voss, that if anything further happens to this property or to me, there will be a very clear trail of evidence pointing in your direction." Voss looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Wesley. "And you are," he said. "Wesley Talbot," Wesley said. "I'm working for Caleb Pruitt. I'm also a witness to this conversation and to the condition of this property when I arrived 2 weeks ago." Voss absorbed this. Caleb Pruitt was a name that carried weight in the county, a man with a long memory and connections that went further than Voss's own. Wesley saw the calculation happening behind those Winterwater eyes. "The offer stands," Voss said finally, "at $200. "The answer is no," Grace said. "It will always be no. I'd like you to leave my land." Voss left. He did not threaten them directly because he was too careful for that. But as he mounted his horse and turned away, he said, without looking back, "This is harder country than you think, Mrs. Ralston," and the words had the quality of a statement about the weather, calm and certain and impersonal. When he was gone, Grace sat down on a sawbuck and breath for a moment. Wesley came and sat beside her. "You were remarkable," he said quietly. "I was terrified," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you were remarkable, Both things can be true. She looked at him, and she thought that both things were always true, in her experience, and that the capacity to hold that truth and keep going anyway was the thing that separated a person from being beaten. She thought that Wesley Talbot was the only man she had met in a long time who understood that, who did not require you to be either fearless or defeated, who simply accepted that you were both frightened and capable and proceeded on that basis. She did not say any of that. She said, "We need to finish the roof before it rains." He smiled. "Then let's get to it." The new house was finished by the end of May. It was smaller than the original, a single large room with a sleeping loft and a proper stone chimney that Wesley built with a care that clearly came from some personal pride about chimney building, setting each stone level and tight. It was clean and solid and smelled of new timber, and Grace stood inside it on the evening it was done and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was that it was possible to love two houses, to love the one that was gone and the one that stood in its place, without either love diminishing the other. Wesley had made himself a small space in the corner of the new barn, which they had built plain and functional, wide enough for 4 animals. He could have gone to Pruitt's ranch every evening and come back each morning, but there was always a reason to stay, always one more thing to be done, and Grace noticed this without commenting on it and was glad of it in a way she was not quite ready to examine. She wrote to her sister Alina in Missouri, not the letters she had been writing and burning through the winter, full of things she was trying not to feel, but a real letter that said, "I am building things back. I have a neighbor who helps me. His name is Wesley Talbot, and I do not yet know what that means, but I think it means something." She planted the garden in the first week of June, working from seeds she had bought in Dodge City, and some she had cadged from Mrs. Henderson, who came by one afternoon to see the rebuilt house, and approved of it with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who respects industry. Mrs. Henderson also, with the candor of someone who has known you long enough to abandon social niceties, looked at Wesley Talbot for a long time and then looked at Grace with an expression that said volumes without any words at all. "He seems like a good man," she said when Wesley was out of earshot. "He is," Grace said. "You could do with a good man." "Clara," Grace said. I know," Mrs. Henderson said. "Mind my business." She paused. "He looks at you the way my Albert looked at me when we were courting." "Goodbye, Clara," Grace said, but she was smiling when she said it. Wesley rode to Pruitt's ranch 3 times a week to do the work he was being paid for. Pruitt's operation was a large one, several hundred head of cattle on a spread that ran east toward the Arkansas River, and managing it required genuine expertise. Wesley brought that expertise and Pruitt valued it, and the arrangement worked. But the days Wesley was at Pruitt's ranch were different days for Grace, longer somehow, the silence of the homestead more present, more noticeable. She told herself this was because she was alone, and she had been alone all winter, and the company of another person had reminded her of what company felt like. This was true as far as it went. The truth that went further was that she specifically missed Wesley Talbot, not just company, him. His voice asking practical questions, the way he sharpened a pencil carefully before writing anything down, as if the act of sharpening were a kind of preparation for thought. The way he treated her opinions about the construction, the garden, the situation with Voss, as opinions worth having, as the conclusions of someone who had lived in this place for 5 years and knew it in ways that mattered. She had been married for 5 years to a man she loved, and she knew what love felt like, and she was not going to be careless with the word. But she also was 31 years old, and she had been widowed 7 months, and she was not going to be careless with that fact either, because time did not stop being real simply because grief wanted it to. Something shifted between them in the middle of June. It was evening, and they were at the fire again, which had become their habit, eating supper and talking through the day the way people do when they have spent enough time working in proximity that the work has become the architecture of their relationship. Grace had received a letter that day from her sister Alina, the first response to the letter she had sent, and Alina had written warmly and at length, asking about Wesley Talbot in terms that were both transparent and affectionate. Grace read aloud one of Alina's questions. She wants to know if you have honorable intentions. Wesley looked up from his plate. Does she? My sister is direct, Grace said. It's a family trait. I've noticed, he said, a pause. The fire moved in the evening wind. Do you? She asked, not coyly, not nervously, simply. He put down his plate and looked at her with that full, serious attention he had. Yes, he said, I do. And I've been trying to go about this carefully because I know what you've been through and I don't want to make you feel like something is being rushed or taken from you. Nothing is being taken from me, she said. The opposite of that is what's been happening, if anything. Grace, he said, and it was the first time he had said her name, just her given name without the formal address, and it came out of him like something he had been holding carefully for a long time. I want to stay here. Not to manage Prute's ranch from a distance and visit 3 days a week. I mean here, if that's something you'd have me do. She was quiet for a moment. The nighthawks were calling. The prairie was enormous and dark around them, and the fire was the center of everything. I was in love with Thomas for 5 years, she said, and I grieve him. I will probably always grieve him in some part of myself. I need you to know that and to be at peace with it. I know it, he said, and I am. I'm not the same woman I was before last November, she said. I don't know if that woman comes back or if she's gone and I'm someone different now. You're Grace Ralston, he said. That's who's here. That's who I want to stay here with. She looked at him for a long time. The fire burned between them and the stars came out above the Kansas prairie, hundreds of them, brilliant and indifferent and beautiful. Then stay, she said. He did not leap up and close the distance between them. He reached across the space between them, across the small distance that was the most significant territory either of them had crossed in a long time, and he took her hand. His hand was rough from work and warm from the fire, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and into her chest like something filling a space that had been cold for a long time. They sat like that for a long while, watching the fire burn down, and it was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that had its own particular shape, something new and different from what had come before, but no less real for that. In the weeks that followed, they moved carefully and honestly, which was the only way either of them knew how to move. Wesley began keeping more of his belongings at the homestead and less at Prute's. He and Prute worked out an arrangement where Wesley would oversee the ranch operations from a distance for 2/3 of his previous time, riding out 3 mornings a week, and Prute accepted this because Wesley was good enough at his job that 3 days was worth more than another man's 7. Prute also, because he was an observant man, understood what was happening and approved of it, and he said so bluntly when Wesley explained the change. You're a smarter man than you used to be, Prute told him. I'm trying to be, Wesley said. Grace continued to develop the homestead. She was a woman with a gift for growing things that was almost stubborn in its quality, the kind of gardener who coaxed yields from difficult conditions through a combination of knowledge and sheer will. The garden she planted in June was producing by August, tomatoes and beans and squash and corn, more than she needed for herself, and she began trading the surplus with the Hendersons and with a family named Sorensen who had taken land a mile to the west of her. She also began raising chickens again, 12 new hens and a rooster she bought from a man in town, and she moved through her days with the focused energy of a person who has found their footing again after a long slide. She was sad sometimes, in the way that grief works on a person not as a single event, but as a recurring weather that appears without warning and passes when it passes. She let herself be sad when she was sad, and she did not make it smaller than it was. Wesley understood this and did not try to fix it. He would sit with her when she was sad, or he would give her space when she needed it, reading the difference the way a good horseman reads an animal, not by formula but by attention. They took a picnic to the creek that ran a mile south of the homestead in late July, a Sunday when the work was caught up and the day was clear and hot and brilliant. They sat in the shade of the cottonwood trees that grew along the bank and ate cold chicken and biscuits that Grace had baked that morning. And they talked about everything and nothing the way people do when they are in the good company of each other. He told her about the Texas hill country in spring, and she told him about the Missouri town she had grown up in. He told her about the cattle drives, the enormous scale of them, thousands of head moving north in a column that stretched as far as you could see, the sound and smell of it that was unlike anything else in the world. She told him about the year before she and Thomas came west, when she had been working as a seamstress in a dry goods store in St. Louis, and had been so bored by the sameness of it that she had agreed to marry a man she barely knew and moved to Kansas partly because anything was better than that particular sameness. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Coming west?" "Never," she said. "Not for a single day. Even now." "Especially now," she said, and she looked at him in the cottonwood shade and meant it in more than one direction. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to change the terms of what was happening, and he kissed her. It was a careful and sincere kiss, not tentative but not presumptuous, the kiss of a man who knows what he's doing and is not in a hurry, and Grace felt it in the place that had been quiet inside her since November, felt it wake something up that she had not known was still capable of waking. She kissed him back with the same honesty she brought to everything, and when they drew apart and looked at each other in the filtered light under the cottonwoods, she thought that whatever came next, she was not afraid of it. The matter of Harlan Voss did not resolve itself simply because she wanted it to. Through July and into August, there were signs that he had not abandoned his interest in her property. A fence line moved on the east edge of her land, a section of irrigation ditch that seemed to have been deliberately blocked. Wesley dealt with the fence line by resetting it clearly at the proper boundary and documenting the original position, and Grace brought the matter of the ditch before the county land office and got a formal record of the obstruction on file. There was also the question of the sheriff, who had done nothing about Grace's report of the arson, and who continued to do nothing with the consistency of a man who has been paid to do nothing. Wesley rode to Dodge City and had a conversation with the county attorney, a younger man named Daniel Cross, who had not yet been absorbed into Voss's circle of influence, and who was sufficiently ambitious about his career to see value in pursuing a matter that involved documented arson and possible murder. Cross opened a formal inquiry. He interviewed Grace. He interviewed the Hendersons, who had been woken by the firelight the night of the blaze, and who had seen, in their account, a rider moving away from the Ralston property at a speed inconsistent with casual travel. He interviewed Caleb Pruitt, who had information about Voss's pattern of behavior toward other homesteaders in the county. The inquiry was slow, the way legal things are slow, but it was moving. In the meantime, Voss himself seemed to recede slightly, the way a storm sometimes moves away from a specific location without dissipating entirely. Grace knew he had not given up. She also knew that she was less vulnerable than she had been, that the network of knowledge and documentation and witnesses around her property was considerably denser than it had been in the days when Thomas had faced him alone. She thought about Thomas more than she might have expected during this period, and differently than she had before. In the winter of her grief, she had thought about him with a pain that was primarily about loss. Now she thought about him with something that was more like conversation, as if she were telling him things. She told him about Wesley in these internal conversations, and she imagined Thomas listening with his particular kind of serious attention, the same attention he gave anything that mattered, and she imagined him saying something that was both practical and kind, the way he always was. She thought he would have liked Wesley Talbot. She thought he would have been glad. September arrived with a change in the air, the first coolness of the turning year, and Grace and Wesley had their first real argument on a Tuesday morning when he came back from Pruitt's ranch, with the information that Voss had been talking to people in Dodge City about a plan to dam the creek further upstream, a plan that, if implemented, would significantly reduce the water reaching the southern homesteads, including Grace's property. Cross can look into that too, Grace said immediately. Cross is looking into the arson, Wesley said. He's one man with limited resources and Voss has 5 lawyers. We need to think about this differently. How differently? She asked. I've been talking to Pruitt about forming a water rights association, he said. Several of the homesteaders along this stretch pooling resources to legally protect the water access. That's a good idea, Grace said. How long would it take? 6 months, maybe more. In the meantime, Voss can move on the dam. Then we need Cross to get an injunction while the association forms, she said. That's what I said to Cross, Wesley told her. He said he could try, but he's not certain he can sustain it without more evidence. Then we get more evidence, she said. Grace, he said it carefully. I want to talk about something else. She looked at him. I want to talk about what happens long term, he said. With the land, with everything. I want to talk about us building something here that's ours, not just something you're protecting or something I'm helping to rebuild, but something we build together going forward. She understood what he was saying. She had been expecting it in the way you expect something that has been gathering itself slowly. Are you asking me to marry you? She said. I am, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was uncertain of her feeling, but because she wanted to honor the weight of the question. Marriage meant something real. It meant agreeing to share the hardships and joys of a life with another person, and she had done that before and knew exactly how serious it was. I want to say yes, she said. I do want to say yes. But he said gently, but I want to be sure you understand what you're taking on, she said. This land, this fight, Voss and the water rights and everything Cross is working on. This isn't simple or settled. It could get harder before it gets easier. I know that, he said. And I'm not going to be a different kind of woman than I am, she said. I'm going to fight for this land and make my own decisions and argue with you when I think you're wrong. You've been arguing with me since the second day I was here, he said. I've found it generally improves outcomes, she laughed. And then she said, yes, Wesley, yes, I'll marry you. He crossed the room to her and held her face in his calloused hands and kissed her the way a man kisses a woman when he has just been told something that is the best thing he has heard in a very long time. And she kissed him back with her whole heart, all of it. The part that had loved Thomas and grieved him, and the part that had been rebuilt alongside the house, and the part that was new and his alone. They were married in November, exactly 1 year after Thomas Ralston's death, which Grace chose deliberately and which Wesley understood without her having to explain it. The ceremony was held in the First Methodist Church in Dodge City, which was a small and unremarkable building with good acoustics and a preacher named Reverend Cole who had a gift for saying important things without making them sound rehearsed. Caleb Pruitt came. The Hendersons came. The Sorensens came. Daniel Cross came, because he had become something of an ally by that point, and several of the other homesteaders who had joined or were joining the Water Rights Association came, filling the small church with the particular warmth of people who have been through difficulty together and are glad to celebrate something. Grace wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue wool serge that she had bought from the mercantile on a trip to town in October and spent 3 evenings sewing, and she wore her hair pinned up with the ivory combs Thomas had given her on their wedding day. She wore them knowing what they were and what they had meant, and Wesley saw them and said nothing, which was exactly right. The reception was held at the Pruitt Ranch, where there was a large enough space and sufficient food and, Pruitt being Pruitt, very good whiskey. People danced. Clara Henderson played the fiddle with an enthusiasm that more than compensated for her technical limitations. Grace danced with Wesley in the firelight of the Pruitt barn, and felt the solidity of him and the warmth of his hand at her back, and looked up at his face, and thought that life was strange and various, and that its strangeness and variety were themselves a kind of gift. They rode home late under a November sky that was so thickly starred it looked like spilled salt on black velvet, and when they came to the homestead and Wesley helped her down from the horse, she stood for a moment looking at the house, the new house, the house they had built together over those intense and difficult weeks in the spring. It looked different than the one Thomas had built. It looked like itself, like something new. She took Wesley's hand and they went inside. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a working winter, the kind that does not pause for sentiment. The Water Rights Association that Wesley had been organizing with Prout and the other homesteaders formally incorporated in December, with Grace as one of its founding members. The only woman in the group and the one who, according to Caleb Prout, argued the most effectively for the specific language in the founding documents that would make the legal protections meaningful. Daniel Cross used the association's formation to file for a formal injunction against any upstream modifications to the creek system, and the injunction was granted in January by a circuit judge who had no connections to Harlan Voss. The arson investigation moved more slowly, but it moved. Cross was building his case carefully, and by February he had enough evidence to file formal charges against two men who had worked for Voss and whose statements, obtained under sufficient legal pressure, implicated Voss himself in directing the fire. Harlan Voss, when he understood what was coming, did something that neither Grace nor Wesley had anticipated. He left. He had other operations in other states. A man of his wealth always had somewhere else to be, and Dodge City was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for him as the legal net tightened. He left in March, deeding his local properties to a manager and taking himself to Colorado, where presumably he intended to recommence his operations under different circumstances. The two men who had set the fire were tried in April. They were convicted on arson charges and received sentences of 3 to 5 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary. The question of Thomas Ralston's death was investigated but never formally resolved to the standard of criminal charges, which was a frustration that Grace carried with her, a stone that she set down in a place where she could acknowledge it without being undone by it. She knew what she knew. The record was clear enough that anyone who examined it would know too, and Harlan Voss was gone, which meant the land was safe and the water rights were protected, and the men who had lit the match had faced consequences. It was not everything. It was enough. Grace was expecting their first child by the time the trial concluded, a fact she had established in February with a certainty that was equal parts joy and disbelief. She told Wesley on a Sunday morning when the weather was warm enough to sit on the porch, a February thaw that would not last but was genuinely warm in that moment, and she watched his face when she said it, and what she saw there was something she had not quite expected, which was that he went very still, and then his expression did something complicated and private and beautiful, like a man receiving news so large that he has to stand inside it for a moment before he can respond. "Grace," he said. "Just that?" "Yes," she said. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his eyes bright, and then he said very quietly, "I didn't know if this would happen for us." "Neither did I," she said. He reached out and put his hand against her face with a gentleness that was complete and deliberate, and she covered his hand with hers, and they stayed like that in the February sun, this man and this woman on the porch of their rebuilt home in the middle of the enormous Kansas prairie, with something new and alive between them that was both theirs and its own. Their son was born in September of 1885, on a clear and windy Tuesday morning when the cottonwoods along the creek had just begun to turn. Mrs. Henderson was there, serving as midwife with the competent certainty of a woman who had done this many times, and Wesley waited in the yard because that was how it was done, and he was not a man who disregarded how things were done simply because waiting was difficult. Grace was not going to let him know how much it helped that she could hear him out there, his boots crossing the yard, back and forth, the sound of him being present. When Mrs. Henderson brought Wesley in and put the baby in his arms, Grace watched from the bed, exhausted and alert and unable to look away from her husband's face as he looked at their son for the first time. He held the child with the careful attention he brought to everything. his big hands cradling the small, warm weight of him, and he looked down at this new person with an expression that had no name in Grace's vocabulary, something large and quiet and entirely unguarded. "Thomas Wesley Talbot," Grace said. Wesley looked up at her. "Thomas for his grandfather in spirit," she said, "and Wesley for his father." He sat beside her on the bed, and she leaned into him. This man who had ridden in off a wagon road on a morning when she had nothing in her hands, and the baby breathed between them with the focused, unconscious authority of a new person learning to exist. The years that followed were years of building, in every sense of the word. The homestead grew. Wesley added to the barn in the spring of 1886, making it large enough for 6 animals, and Grace expanded the garden into a proper kitchen garden with raised beds and a dedicated herb section that she ran with the precision of someone who has decided that her vegetables are going to be excellent and is not willing to accept a lesser outcome. She began selling garden produce regularly to a store in Dodge City, a supplementary income that was not large but was consistent and was entirely hers. Wesley's work with the Water Rights Association became a significant part of his time and ultimately a small but real portion of his income, as the association grew to include 30 homesteads along the creek system and required genuine administrative attention. He had a gift for the administrative side of it, which surprised him: the meetings and the documents and the careful mediation of disputes between members. He had spent his life thinking of himself as a man of action and physical competence, and he was those things, but he was also, it turned out, a man who could think carefully in a group and bring people to agreement without making them feel managed. Thomas grew from a baby to a toddler with the focused urgency that children bring to growing, as if they have an internal schedule and intend to keep it. He was dark-haired like Wesley and had Grace's eyes, that particular clear gray blue that she had from her Missouri grandmother, and he was opinionated from very early on in a way that delighted them both, even when it was inconvenient. He had strong views about which horses he was allowed to pet and what he would and would not eat, and when he wanted to be carried and when he intended to walk himself. "Thank you very much." And he communicated all of these views with a certainty that Grace recognized as a family trait. She was happy. She noticed this as a fact the same way she had noticed, at the worst times, that she was not happy, with the same honest assessment. She was happy in a way that had texture and weight to it, not the uncomplicated happiness of someone who has never been tested, but the happiness of a person who has been through something real and come out the other side of it into something real. It was not the same happiness she had had with Thomas, and she did not want it to be. It was its own thing, shaped by who she was now, which was different from who she had been, and by who Wesley was, which was particular and specific and daily more familiar to her in the way that makes you realize you cannot imagine the landscape without the person in it. She told him this once, on an evening in the late fall of 1886, when Thomas was asleep in the loft, and the fire was burning and the prairie wind was loud against the window. She told him that she could not imagine the landscape without him in it, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had gone deep, and then he said that this was the first place in his adult life that had felt like something he was building toward rather than passing through. "Kansas," she said, a little amused. "You," he said simply. In the spring of 1887, Grace discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Wesley in the kitchen while he was having his morning coffee, because there was no particular dramatic occasion for it. It was simply part of the ongoing conversation of their life, and she said it plainly, and he set down his coffee and came around the table and held her with a warmth that was entirely domestic and entirely sufficient. Their daughter arrived in December, on a cold night with snow falling soft and steady outside, and she was small and ferociously healthy, and she screamed her entrance into the world with what Mrs. Henderson described as exceptional vigor. They named her Eleanor Margaret, Eleanor for Grace's sister in Missouri, and Margaret for Wesley's mother, who had kept her land in Texas as long as she could and had never, in Wesley's account of her, stopped believing that she deserved to have it. Eleanor Margaret Talbot grew into someone who combined her mother's stubbornness with her father's humor, which made for a personality that was both difficult and irresistible. Thomas, 3 years older and in possession of a particular older sibling gravity that he took very seriously, regarded his sister with a mix of propriety and adoration that never really changed. He was the one who held her hand on the walk to school when the Sorensons' eldest daughter and a couple of other children formed a small country school in 1890, and he was the one who, later, told her parents things about her that he thought they should know, with the informative loyalty of someone who believes the family unit should operate on complete information. The school was organized by several of the homesteader women in the area, led by Grace, and a woman named Petra Sorensen, who was energetic and practical, and had taught school in Sweden before she and her husband came to America. They hired a schoolteacher from Wichita, a young woman named Abigail Park, who was 22 and earnest and extremely well-read, and the school operated out of a single room that the fathers of the community built in the spring of 1890 on land that Caleb Prout donated for the purpose, because Prout was, as Grace often said, a man who made up for a great many things by being genuinely useful when it counted. The homestead by 1890 was a different place than the ashes Grace had stood in front of on that May morning in 1884. The house had been expanded in 1888, a new room added on the south side with proper framed windows, a luxury that Grace had waited years for and appreciated every morning in a way that never became ordinary. The barn was large and well kept. The garden was the most productive in the area, a source of quiet pride that Grace carried about in the way that practical people carry pride, without talking about it much, but also without pretending it isn't there. There were 6 horses, 2 milk cows, 50 laying hens, and the pigs that Wesley had started raising in 1886 because pork prices in Dodge City were consistently good. The land itself, the 12 acres of it that Thomas Ralston had filed on in 1878 and that Grace had refused to sell even when she stood in the ashes of everything else, was well worked and healthy. The well still ran clean and deep. The water rights that the association protected still flowed through the irrigation channels that ran along the south side of the property. Everything that Harlan Voss had tried to take was here, intact, improved, alive with the evidence of what 2 people working together could do with a piece of ground they believed in. Grace stood at the edge of the garden one evening in October of 1890, looking at the house with its new room and its lamplight in the windows, listening to Thomas and Eleanor's voices inside, hearing Wesley's voice in response to something one of them had said, and the laughter that followed, all 3 of them laughing at something that she couldn't quite hear from out here. The evening air was cooling, the way October evenings in Kansas cool dramatically after the warmth of the day, and the prairie around her was amber and gold in the last light. She thought about the morning she had stood at the edge of burned timbers with her hands empty at her sides. She thought about hoofbeats on a wagon road and a stranger's voice asking where to begin. She thought about the specific courage it takes to begin anything when you are not sure you have the strength for it. She thought that beginning was itself the bravest thing, and that it was possible to begin more than once. That this, in fact, was the secret, that life was not one single arc with a beginning and an end, but a series of beginnings, each one requiring its own courage, each one offering its own particular kind of grace. She went inside. Wesley looked up from the table where he was sitting with Thomas, who was 7 now, and in the middle of what appeared to be a fairly complex arithmetic problem that had produced a significant amount of erasing. Eleanor, at 4, was sitting on a braided rug near the fireplace talking very earnestly to a ragdoll named Harriet. The room smelled of the supper Grace had cooked and of wood smoke and wool and lamp oil and everything that meant home. "There you are," Wesley said. "Here I am," she said. He watched her come inside and hang her coat on the hook by the door, and the way he looked at her still, after 6 years, was the way she had first noticed on that burned morning, the look that did not calculate and did not deflect but simply saw. She had come to understand that this was how he loved, wholly and attentively, without reservation or performance. She sat beside him at the table and looked at Thomas's arithmetic problem and found the error in the third line. And Thomas received this information with the philosophical acceptance of a child who is accustomed to his mother being right about things. Eleanor brought Harriet over and placed her in Grace's lap with the solemnity of a formal presentation, then climbed up herself, and Grace sat with her daughter in her lap and her hand on her son's shoulder, and Wesley beside her reading the letter that had come that day from the Water Rights Association about a meeting in December. And the fire burned in the fireplace, and the wind moved across the prairie outside, and the night came on in its immense and starry way. Later, after the children were in the loft and the house was quiet, Grace and Wesley sat by the dying fire the way they always did in the evenings, the way they had from the very beginning, when they had sat at a campfire over bean and bacon, and she had told him about Thomas and he had listened. The habit of the evening fire had become the shape of their companionship, the place where the day became a conversation, and the conversation became their ongoing life. "I got a letter from Eleanor," Grace said. Her sister, not her daughter, she still sometimes had to specify, which amused them both. "What does she say?" "She's coming in the spring, she and Charles and the boys." "Good," Wesley said. "It's time you had your sister here." "It's been 7 years," Grace said. "She needs to see what we've built." He looked at her with the slight smile he had, the one that was not quite as contained as he thought it was. "She'll see it," he said. The fire settled. The clock on the mantel, Thomas Ralston's clock, the one Grace had found in the ashes with its glass cracked and its mechanism intact, ticked steadily in the way it had always ticked, faithful and continuous, marking the time of everything that happened in this house and everything that would happen in it. Grace reached over and took Wesley's hand, and he turned his over and held hers, and neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to. And the fire burned down to coals and the stars wheeled overhead in the enormous Kansas sky. And in the loft above them, their children slept the deep and uncomplicated sleep of children who have never stood at the edge of anything burned, who have been given instead a house built twice, and a well that never ran dry, and 2 parents who understood that love was not a single moment of beginning, but every day of what came after. In the spring, when Eleanor arrived with her husband Charles and their 3 boys, Grace stood on the porch and watched the wagon come up the road, and felt the specific joy of a reunion that has been imagined so many times it has become almost its own separate memory. Eleanor was older. They both were, 7 years older, and she embraced Grace on the porch steps with the fierceness of a woman who does not take sisters for granted. Then Eleanor stepped back and looked at the house, the expanded house with its new room and its glass windows, and she looked at the barn and the garden and the yard where Thomas II was showing Eleanor II, a complicated system of sticks and string that he had devised for some purpose that neither of their parents had fully understood. And Eleanor looked at Wesley, who was helping Charles with the horses with the natural ease of a man who is at home in his own yard, and she turned to Grace. "You said a neighbor who helps," Eleanor said. "I did say that," Grace agreed. "You undersold it considerably," Eleanor said. "I tend to," Grace said. Eleanor stayed 3 weeks. It was the best 3 weeks Grace could remember in a long time, the house full of people and noise, and the particular chaos of 5 children of varying ages occupying the same space. Charles and Wesley got along in the easy way of 2 men who have no reason to compete and several reasons to be allies, and they spent an afternoon walking the property together while Grace and Eleanor sat on the porch in the April sun and talked without stopping for hours. She told Eleanor everything. Not in the chronological and careful way she had reported facts to the land office or the judge, but the whole of it, the night of the fire and the morning after, the hoofbeats on the wagon road, and the voice she had heard saying, "Where do we begin?" The weeks of building and the evenings at the fire, and the slow and honest process of falling in love with a man who had stopped when he didn't have to. She told her about Thomas, her Thomas, and what she still carried of that love, and how she had learned that love doesn't work by subtraction, that you don't love one person less because you love another, that the heart is larger than you think it is when you need it to be. Alina listened to all of it in the way that Alina always listened to Grace, with complete attention and no performance of reaction, waiting until the whole thing was said before she responded. When Grace finished, Alina was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You've built something true." "Yes," Grace said, "I have." "Both times," Alina said. "You've built something true both times." Grace looked at her sister and then out at the yard, where Wesley was coming back across the grass with Charles, saying something that made Charles laugh, and as Wesley came toward the porch his eyes found Grace in the way they always found her, that direct and particular attention, and he raised a hand slightly in the small gesture that meant, "I see you, I'm coming, here I am." "Yes," Grace said again. "Both times." The spring of 1891 brought a good wheat crop, and a new roof on the barn, and the news from Dodge City that Daniel Cross had been elected county attorney for the second time, which Grace considered a genuine public good, and a letter from Caleb Prout saying that he intended to retire and offering Wesley the opportunity to buy his operation at a price he called fair, and which Wesley, after examining the books, agreed was fair. They talked about it for a week, the scale of the purchase, the debt it would incur, the change it would mean. In the end, they decided not to buy Prout's ranch whole. What they decided instead, with the careful practical honesty they brought to all their important decisions, was to buy the easternmost parcel of Prout's land that adjoined their existing homestead, which more than doubled their acreage and included a stretch of the creek that gave them additional water rights. It was manageable as a purchase. It expanded their existing operation in ways that made sense, and it meant that their holding in Kansas was substantial and stable and genuinely theirs. They signed the papers in the Dodge City Land Office, the same land office where Gordon Fleece had confirmed her claim 7 years before. Fleece was still there, slightly grayer, still meticulous, and he witnessed the transaction with the same unhurried precision with which he had witnessed everything else. When they came out onto the plank sidewalk on Front Street, Dodge City was going about its business around them. The cattle trade much diminished now from the wild days of the 70s, but the town still alive, still busy, reorganizing itself into something more settled as the frontier moved west and the land around it filled in. It was different from what it had been. Everything was different from what it had been. Grace and Wesley stood on the sidewalk in the spring afternoon, the signed deed to their expanded property in the envelope he was carrying, and she took his arm because she wanted to and because she could. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. 12 miles south of Dodge City," he said. "That's our land." "That's our land," she said. "All of it. Nobody can take it." He looked down at her with that look that still had the same quality it had always had, the look that saw her fully and without revision, and he said, "I came around a bend in the road 6 years ago, and there you were with your hands empty and your back straight and the stubbornness of a woman who isn't going to let this be the end of her." "My hands weren't really empty," she said. "I still had Thomas's watch." He smiled. "Yes," he said, "you did." The watch was still on the mantel at home, ticking. It would tick for many more years. Thomas II would wind it when he was old enough and would one day take it with him when he went out into the world, carrying in his pocket the small, faithful mechanism that had survived a fire and been found in the ashes by his mother's hands, ticking on through everything. But that was later, and they didn't know it yet. They walked down Front Street in Dodge City on a spring afternoon in 1891, with the sun on their faces, and their names on a deed, and the prairie waiting for them 12 miles south, full of everything they had planted and everything that was growing and everything still to come. The wind was blowing from the south, warm and grassy and enormous, the wind that Grace had been breathing for 13 years, and that was as much a part of her now as her own heartbeat. She breathed it in and thought of all the ways a life could surprise you, all the things that could burn and all the things that could be built, all the mornings you could stand at the edge of something lost and choose again to begin. She tightened her hand on Wesley's arm and they walked on together. These two people who had found each other at the edge of a burned thing and built something whole. And the Kansas sky above them was enormous and blue and entirely indifferent to human drama in the way that only the sky is, which was exactly why you needed someone beside you to make it feel like a place where you belonged. They drove home in the late afternoon, their own horses on their own road, and when the homestead came into view across the flat land, the house and the barn and the garden and the well and the new east pasture that was theirs now, all of it gleaming in the last gold light of the day, Grace leaned against Wesley's shoulder and felt the solidity of him and the warmth of him and was, in the fullest and most honest sense of the word, home. Thomas and Alina were in the yard with the Sorensen girls when they arrived, all 4 children in the middle of some game that had resulted in considerable mud on all concerned. Thomas came running to the wagon with the focused urgency of a child who has news, and the news turned out to be that one of the mares had foaled while they were gone, a bay colt, healthy and perfect, currently in the barn with his mother, and regarded by both children as the most significant event of the year. Wesley jumped down from the wagon and Thomas pulled him toward the barn with the full conviction of someone sharing a miracle, and Grace sat for a moment in the wagon seat, listening to her son's voice and her husband's response, watching Alina make her way more sedately across the yard, because Alina had decided that 8 was old enough for sedateness and was trying it out. Alina looked up at her mother in the wagon seat and said, "Did you get the papers?" "We got the papers," Grace said. Alina considered this with the gravity of someone who understands that property is important without fully understanding why. Then she said, "Thomas says the colt should be named Kansas. What do you say?" "I say we should name him something better than Kansas," Alina said with complete conviction. Grace climbed down from the wagon. "What would you name him?" "I'm deciding," Alina said, and she walked into the barn with the purposeful stride of a small person with an important decision to make. Grace followed her, because that is what you do. You follow the people you love into the places where they're going, and you look at the new thing together, the foal wobbling in the barn's golden light with its long, improbable legs, and you stand next to your husband and your children in the smell of hay and animals, and the particular warmth that living things create when they are gathered together. And you understand that this is what all the burning was for. This is what all the building was for. This moment and the next moment and all the moments after that, unspectacular and irreplaceable and utterly yours. They named the Colt River, which was Alina's decision, and everyone agreed it was better than Kansas, and the foal grew into a fine horse, and the land grew into a fine holding, and Thomas Talbot grew into a fine man, and Alina Talbot grew into a woman her grandmother Margaret would have recognized, stubborn and capable and unwilling to let the land be taken from her. But those are stories for another telling. This one ends here in the barn in the light with all of them together. This one ends with a woman who stood at the edge of a burned homestead with empty hands and said, "All right, let's begin," and a man who answered her, and everything they built between them out of ash and stubbornness, and the kind of love that doesn't ask you to be who you were before the fire but loves who you are now, standing in the ruin of it, alive and ready to work. This is how you begin. This is how it goes. You begin, and then you begin again, and the prairie holds you and the sky watches over you and the wind blows through the years, and the people you love are standing next to you, and the clock on the mantle ticks on through all of it, faithful and unhurried, marking every moment with the small, certain sound of time that will not stop, because there is always more to come.